Hello everyone, welcome to this series of videos about project planning, and in this video I'm going to talk about primary constraint. So the primary constraint is something that we define at the very beginning of the project, because every project plan must be developed to fit within the boundaries that you have of the project. And those boundaries, remember, is always the scope, schedule, and the resources of the project. But what happens is that normally one of these three constraints is the most important. Okay, how do you determine it? That will depend on what is the reason behind the project. So for example, a project where it's a crisis management, you have to come up with a solution for a problem that just happened now, then probably schedule is going to be much more important than scope and resources. A project where you get government funding, for example, and you are very strict by government rules in terms of how you spend the money, then resources probably are going to be the primary constraint. So the reason behind the project and the things that limit your project are what will define what is your primary constraint. So if you have a scope constraint, okay, what do you normally do in terms of planning? I'm going to present now is the three different ways of planning according to what is your primary constraint. If scope is the most important part, then you start by identifying what is it that you need to deliver for the project. All right. Then for each one of the deliverables, you said, okay, what is the quality that I want for each one of those things? So for example, let's imagine that my project is to organize a wedding. All right, so in that wedding there's many deliverables. There's a band, there's, for example, the food, there's the beverage service, and then I would select all these things on step one. On step two, I would say, okay, what is the quality of each one of those things that I want? Do I want an amateur band? Do I want a band that is professional? Do I want something that is a little bit in the middle? Okay, so I'm setting the quality levels for each one of them. On step three, you determine what is the best resource to complete each deliverable. So you would say, all right, what are the equipments or what are the people that I should assign for each one of those tasks in order to achieve the best result? Maybe you have someone in your team that is more specialized into music to select, for example, the best music band for this wedding. Step four would be you estimate the amount of resources needed to complete the deliverables. How much money would you need to get that? And how much time would you have to work on that deliverable in order to be able to obtain it? Then on step five, you schedule it based upon the availabilities you just determined. And finally, on step six, you create your budget. Budget, you will see, is normally the very last thing we can do, because budget is always dependent upon the things we have to define before. If schedule is your primary constraint, then you need to identify your project schedule boundary. In other words, between when and when must your project be done. Then you will set interim project milestones between these boundaries. So I know that your project has to be done, for example, from the 1st of January to the 31st of January. So you might decide that, okay, every Saturday there's a milestone, because you're dividing that part into different components, into different little milestones. And then for each one of those milestones, for example, for the first week, you determine on step three, what are the resources you have available for that first week. Okay. Once you determine the resources you have available for each milestone, then you estimate what quality can I deliver within the resources and the time constraint that I have. And finally, on step five, you would create your budget. If resource is your primary constraint, then you need to identify the project resource constraint. What are the constraints you have? Is it cash? Is it people? Is it equipment? All right. And what type of constraint it is? It is in terms of amount, or is it in terms of timing, right? Then you determine the deliverables that you have for the project and the quality level that you can make with the resources you have. All right. If you have $1,000 and if you have $1 million, the quality you can deliver is very different. On step three, you schedule the deliverables based upon what resources you have available. And finally, on step four, you create your budget. So as you can see, determining the primary constraint is extremely important, because it will determine how you actually plan the project. A project where the primary constraint is scope is very different from a project where the primary constraint is schedule. That is very different of the primary constraint being the resources, and therefore you need to really define it at the very beginning of planning, so you know what are the steps that you must take. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you on the next video of this series.